Next up is Adriana Robertson.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers for this wonderful opportunity, to our wonderful discussant in advance, and to all of you for being here on a Saturday morning. So this is joint work with Jill, so I will run away after the discussion and Jill will answer all your questions. So as some of you may be aware, we had an election recently in the United States, and every time we have an election, there is discussion about, money in politics. And since we're always having an election, we're always having a discussion about money in politics. And so, that money comes from lots of different places, takes lots of different forms, but one of the long-standing places that money can come from is, of course, corporations, right? And there is a long-standing involvement between corporations and politics in the United States. And with that involvement has come controversy, right, over many, many years. Now, this involvement can take a whole bunch of different forms, right? I'm not going to go into all the details. Political scientists study these things. Jill knows lots about them. I know this much about them, mostly what she's tutored me on. And of course, this can take the form of trying to get people elected, right? You can think of it this way, like let's influence the public, which will then lead to the kinds of things that we want. Or you can do lobbying, which is let's influence the elected people to get them to do the things that we want, right? That's kind of like broadly how I think about those two categories of things. Now, importantly, right, this is, after all, we were just hearing about disclosures and SEC stuff, there is an obligation to disclose some of your political involvement as a corporation, but not all of it, and certainly not in one place, right? So there is no single consolidated source of all of this activity. But of course, just because there isn't mandatory disclosure doesn't mean there isn't voluntary, right? And so many corporations, especially large public ones, will disclose stuff, right? Either on their websites or in other places. Okay, one last piece of table setting here. Citizens United, right, an important Supreme Court decision some years ago now, reduced the direct regulation of corporate political activity, right? And really what it sort of did in part was punt that into the realm of ordinary corporate governance. So once we're in the realm of ordinary corporate governance, two things follow from that. One, it means we land in the realm of GCGC, right? And two, it means we land in the realm of shareholder proposals, right? So shareholder proposals, right, we all know what those are. I'm going to skip the slide on that. And I'm just going to say what we're going to do in this project is we're going to investigate the ecosystem of these shareholder proposals that relate to political activity at large public companies, right? So we're going to look at the submission of proposals, we're going to look at the outcomes, and we're going to look at subsequent issuer behavior. Now, between the time we submitted this paper and now, we've discovered a lot of additional things. We've changed things a lot, lots of new analysis, and probably, I think Jill has provisionally persuaded me that this is two papers, not necessarily just one. But there's a bunch of the results that are provisionally in paper number 2 that I really like, and so if there is time, since I'm the one standing here, I will share some of those with you, since I think they're some of the more interesting parts, and she'll just cover her ears. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this proposal landscape. So our sample, right, these are all political proposals. We kind of broadly lump them in under political, but really this is, you can think of these as election-related, is political with a big P, lobbying, and there's a smaller group of what get called alignment proposals, and this is basically, a corporation says that its values are X, Y, and Z, but it donates money to political entity with goals of not X, not Y, and not Z, right? So that is a misalignment, and there's lots of, not lots, there's a relatively small number actually of proposals asking for disclosure on that. Right? So we look at those S&P 500 companies, we're gonna go from 2015 to 2023. Eric, if you ask a question, I'm gonna say I talked about it in the first 5 minutes. How many of these do we have? Well, the number's actually been pretty steady over the course of our sample period, so it's sort of, call it like 80 to 100 a year. It bops around a little, but there's no major pattern. About 55 to 65 or so get voted on in any given year. Right? With most of the rest, there's, the missing number there is a few omissions, but the rest typically get withdrawn. And I'll say a little bit more about withdrawals because I think they're actually really important. Conditional on being voted on, the level of support tends to be roughly on average, call it, 30% or so. So importantly for our purposes, we use the standard ISS data, that's what everybody uses for shareholder voting. That data turns out not to be great when it comes to withdrawals. Right? So there's a lot of missing withdrawals. That makes sense if you think that the withdrawal never shows up on the proxy statement, And so, you only know about it if the proponent tells you about it. And so ISS has a lot of this, but it's actually missing quite a lot. So we got additional data from a not-for-profit SII, the Sustainable Investment Institute, and I'll show you what that was, that allowed us to do. So our clean data, that's when we supplemented. We also went through the proxy statements and read them and made sure they were right and made some corrections that way. So look, if you look at panel B, on the voted, the numbers are pretty darn similar. ISS is pretty good on those. But on the withdrawals, we go from 208 to 286. That's a pretty large difference, right? And because withdrawals represent typically, not always, but often, settlement, right? If you just think of standard Priest-Klein, if you settled, it probably means you got some or all of what you wanted, right? So if we only look at voted on proposals, we're missing a big chunk of the story. So that's just something to flag for folks. These political proposals, obviously the largest chunk, but lobbying is not too far behind. A small number of alignment, and then climate lobbying, you can think of that as a special case of lobbying. So what do these look like? So this is a political proposal was submitted to Exxon in 2022, right? And what are they asking for? Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to read it in the back. They're asking for a report. Of course they are. It's a shareholder proposal. And that was a joke about shareholder proposals. What do they want to know? They want to know about the policies and procedures for making electoral contributions and expenditures. They want monetary and non-monetary contributions or expenditures on behalf of candidates, parties, and committees, 501c4s, trade associations, right? So they want the whole gamut. And they want them to identify all recipients and the amounts paid, right? So it's very capacious. Now, very often with these types of disclosure request proposals, you're not going to get all of it, but you might get partial disclosure at some point down the line, and that's typically what will ultimately happen. Okay, so that's the landscape that we're talking about. So who's bringing these things and where are they bringing them? If you've ever spent any time in shareholder proposal space, which I know many of you have, these are going to look like kind of the usual suspects. So I went through and I classified each proponent into one of these categories, and obviously this adds up to more than 100% because you can have multiple proponents on the same proposal. ESG managers, that's like your Boston Commons, Zevin Asset Management, and the like. Public pension funds are also very active in this space. But here's something that I do want to flag. As we were working on this project, it became clear to us that this not-for-profit entity, the Center for Political Accountability, plays a really important role in this space. Right? So they do a number of different things. One of the things they do is they have a model proposal, right? And they also work directly with shareholders, right, with active proponent groups, to help them figure out where to bring these proposals. So we identified which of the proposals that we have came through working with the CPA from their own account of who they worked with. And so the CPA column, that is a subset of the political column, right? So all CPA proposals are political proposals, but not all political are, of course, CPA. And so as you can see, for example, with the public pension funds, the overwhelming majority of the proposals they're bringing are actually bringing in conjunction with the Center for Political Accountability, right? So because of this, or their job, their sort of interest is political transparency. I'm not going to make a comment about the fact that they're doing a lot of things behind the scenes by working with proponents and maybe not having their own name on these proposals. In addition to that sort of work, they're also putting together data, right? So what they do is very helpful. They go through the disclosures that companies make about their political activities, and they create an index. They call it the Zicklin Index. And then we can rely on that as sort of a quantitative measure of the company's disclosures around their political activities. In addition, they collect data. 527 spending is one category of political spending. To the best of our knowledge, nobody's ever done any work in the corporate governance space looking at this. Some people have looked at PAC spending. Nobody's looked at this. When I talk about 527, think Republican Governors Association or Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee. They are trying to get people elected, but it is not a donation to a specific candidate, right? So think of this as these umbrella electoral spending groups, right? 527 obviously is a provision of the tax code. So because of this, we're going to focus a lot of our analysis on political proposals, and we're going to look separately, right, at these two different categories of proposals. So let me do that very quickly. So the first question is, well, who's getting these proposals? What companies, right, among S&P 500 companies, where do we tend to see them? Well, when you bring one of these CPA political proposals, it does not appear to be tied to financial performance. So this is just like alpha, right, in the last year. They don't seem to be targeting badly performing companies. I mean, that's fine. That makes sense. Could have gone either way. They do, however, seem to really care about your previous disclosures. So what this is measuring, so according to all of the conversations that we had and also kind of like common sense, company transparency tends to be compared to its peers, right? So you'll compare a company and you'll say, well, relative to your peers, do you disclose more or less? So we're going to define a leader as being within an industry year, right? Are you the top quartile? A laggard is the bottom quartile. Omitted category is, the middle. And so if you are a leader, right, if you disclose more than your peers, then you are much less likely to get one of these proposals. The mean value of the dependent variable here is like 4, so 5.7 is big. If you are a laggard, you are more likely to get one of these proposals. Okay, so the CPA proposals seem to be targeted at whether you were doing a lot of disclosing in the past. I don't see really much of a relationship here when we look at the spending. So this is that 527 spending. There are some stars, but there's no meaningful relationship here. It's kind of like a weird hump, and I don't really interpret that as telling us very much. So the CPA proposals seem to be about this disclosure. What about the non-CPA proposals, the ones that aren't brought in conjunction with this not-for-profit? Still doesn't seem to be a story about financial performance. Doesn't seem to be a story about existing disclosure, at least not based on this index. But it does really seem to be a story related to the 527 spending, right? We can see this is a monotonic relationship, and it becomes really quite large, right? And it just marches up as you go up the quintiles. So in other words, what we seem to be finding is the CPA proposals tend to be targeted at companies with poor disclosure. The non-CPA proposals seem to be targeted at companies that actually do a lot of spending, right? And you can think of the 527 as being like a proxy, maybe a sort of a canary in the coal mine about other activities. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to zip through, what happens afterwards. Some of the proposals get withdrawn, some of them get omitted. It's really hard to interpret what it means to have a withdrawal, because after all, maybe you got some of what you wanted, we'll never know. Instead, I'm going to show you in a moment what actually happens, which I think is more meaningful. Omissions, that's usually like somebody messed up and also the company doesn't like you, right? It needs to be both of those things for it to get omitted. Because if you mess it up and the company likes you, they can still keep the proposal on their proxy. Again, voting support, in the interest of time, I'm going to zip through this. There's not all that many, and it's really hard to measure much. And anyway, they're precatory, right? So instead of showing you the voting results, what I'm going to do is show you what the companies do later. So we can now look at, well, what do the disclosures look like in subsequent years? What is the change in the level of disclosure? And so what we find is, after one of these CPA proposals was withdrawn, right, the following year, the level of disclosure goes up pretty significantly. Right? So in other words, a company came and said, I'm working with the CPA, I don't like your disclosure, here's my proposal. This is certainly consistent with the idea that as part of that settlement, the company agrees to disclose more and indeed does disclose more. In contrast, when the non-CPA proposals, which remember, were never targeted at disclosure numbers as measured by that index, they don't seem to be getting more of that disclosure later. Right? So consistent with something rational happening here. Notice a very similar pattern. When something is voted on, when a CPA proposal is voted on, you also get more disclosure in the following years. Right? Not nearly as much going on with the non-CPA proposals. Please don't ask me to comment on a regression with 28 observations. Okay. Since I have a minute left, I have a minute to show you some of the voting stuff that's going to go into provisionally paper 2. What we did was we took the 9 largest asset managers and the 9 largest public pension funds, and we looked at how they vote on these proposals. So this is now all of the proposals again. And we found something, I think this is like the most interesting thing so far, which is why I'm insisting on showing it to you. So look, BlackRock and Vanguard very rarely, but not never, right? They sometimes vote for these things, but not very often. Then you've got some of the other big asset managers, like say Fidelity, right? They're voting yes, call it 35% of the time. There's real variation here. T. Rowe is, you get low but not 0. Schwab is in the 25% range. Right? There's a lot of variation. Contrast that with the pension fund, so that's sort of below the dashed line. New York State Common, New York City Retirement, they're voting yes really a large majority of the time. And even the red state pension funds, Texas Teachers, Florida SBA, they're voting yes less, but not all that much less. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, I think, and it's telling us something about the amount of effort that the asset managers and the pension funds are voting here. Because, spoiler, they can't all be copying ISS and Glass Lewis if they're all doing different things, right? So here's another little split. We can split them out by whether there's a public pension fund proponent. Fun fact, the public pension funds really like the proposals that were brought by public pension funds. Right? And again, you don't see the kind of red state, blue state divide that you might otherwise have expected. The asset managers, on the other hand, right, they don't seem to care too much. So I will leave this last slide up since I'm now at 0 minutes, and I will hand the floor over to our wonderful discussant.
I'm glad to be here and to comment on a very exciting paper. I must start with a caveat. I'm not a US lawyer or somebody who studies US law that closely, but I've been given this daunted task of commenting on a paper that's steeped in US law. So it can mean one of two things. Either it's a breath of fresh air, or it can be this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And I hope that it's at least a little bit of the former rather than entirely the latter. So this paper is a very fascinating one, and I divide my comments into 3 parts. One, to give a bit of a background and context, which Adriana has already done, highlight the key contributions of the paper, and spend a little bit more time on further thoughts for consideration by the authors. So as Adriana said, what is fascinating is we are at the 15-year mark after Citizens United, which threw the ball into the court of corporate governance, where the court basically said, political spending is within the realm of the shareholders. Shareholders can decide what they can do. And as a foreign lawyer, this fascinates me, because in most other jurisdictions around the world, political spending is controlled entirely by the shareholders. But here it's about disclosures, and even disclosures are on a precatory basis. So it seems like US operates at a completely different end of the spectrum compared to the rest of the world, but even that is a fascinating kind of discussion. So where does the academic literature stand after Citizens United? There's a lot of theoretical papers that are there. Bebchek and Jackson have come up with a series of papers, and there's also a lot of empirical papers on corporate political spending, especially in the disclosure space. And Jill and Adriana have referred to these papers in their own paper itself, and their paper kind of builds upon some of these existing papers on the topic. So what are the key contributions that their paper makes? One is, as Adriana has already mentioned, there is continued relevance of the topic. And the 2024 elections in the US are a good example. And the continued high-profile bromance that we have seen in the US until very recently, with the nexus between politics and business, is another good example of why this topic continues to be very relevant. And what is important about this paper is that the data collection is very comprehensive compared to the previous papers, because they've not only looked at data from ISS and Sustainable Investment Institute, but they've also used 527 organizations' contributions and put everything together in a very painstaking way. So it's an important data source that is quite significant. Another thing which Adriana didn't have time to speak about, but which I think is a very important contribution of the paper, is they've also spoken to investors on the second part of the paper, which I'll come to, which is a unique contribution that the other papers don't talk about. And they not only look at the votes that have actually taken place, but they also look at withdrawals, which, as she mentioned, plays an important story as an important aspect of decision-making in political spending space. And what is interesting about this paper, which other papers don't do, is this distinction between the role of the CPA and non-CPA. So this is an important aspect as well of this paper. And as Adriana mentioned, there are 2 parts to the paper. The first part is about issuers. What is happening? How are the issuers getting targeted? And the second part of the paper looks at the converse, which is who are the investors who are targeting and how are they making decisions? And to me, looking from the outside and having read some of the literature while researching for this, it seems like it adds a lot, not just to political spending, but also to shareholder disclosure, shareholder proposals more generally. So these are all the good things. And there are no bad things, by the way, just some comments for consideration of the authors. So I'll divide my comments into 2 parts. One is about the scope and the research design. The second is to urge the authors to kind of use this data to come up with very interesting normative implications. I think there's a lot in the paper, which either in paper 1 or paper 2, they can be developed substantially. So those are some thoughts for consideration. So the first question is, what is the underlying research question and data and the hypothesis? And what I did here, I hope it's not too out of whack, but I reverse engineered to build a set of hypotheses from the paper. Maybe they're too stark. They're probably over the top compared to what you may have thought about, but I thought these are two ways of thinking about the paper. The first thing is the paper challenges the conventional wisdom, and the conventional wisdom is that shareholder proposals don't really make sense, especially in the context of political spending. But the hypothesis that this paper could begin with is that the shareholder process is at least somewhat responsive to the question of political expenditure and transparency, and may have some sense in improving transparency from the perspective of political expenditure. And the second hypothesis is there is no homogeneity in investor preferences while voting. In fact, on the contrary, there's significant variance in the strategies and outcomes of investors. So these are kind of proposals or hypotheses that one could start with in terms of understanding and analyzing their paper. So coming to some suggestions and questions on the scope, I think couple of things to think about is, what are shareholders exactly voting on? And the paper talks about political expenditures, but one thing that also relates to this is the question of lobbying. So the paper is somewhat half-hearted about the question of lobbying. So there is a mention of lobbying, and there's a snapshot analysis of lobbying, but it would be interesting to see how lobbying fits within the context of political expenditure. What is the interlinkage between the two? Why doesn't, for example, CPA or the index cover lobbying? That's an interesting question to think about. So the scope of the paper is an important aspect. The second aspect that I thought is an interesting question to think about is the role of the CPA itself. And a lot of what the paper talks about is the use of shareholder proposals against laggards in the CPA-Zicklin index to improve their transparency. Now, one thing I found fascinating, I know you mentioned it in your paper briefly, but I think it's worth examining. Who puts out the CPA-Zicklin index? CPA itself is part of the index manufacturer, so to speak. And who's bringing these proposals? CPA is an entrepreneur bringing these proposals. So my question there is there some kind of box ticking going on? Is CPA trying to get their companies through proposals to comply with their own index? So are they kind of defining the process? And I think that this issue is very valuable, and you have the data because you have the CPA data and the non-CPA data. If you had only the CPA data, I think you wouldn't be able to check that. But I think having the fact, given the fact that you have both, I think this is a question worth delving into even further in these circumstances. So I'll just go to the final section. I only have 2 minutes left in the normative implications. And I think here there's a lot that can be said, even from a comparative perspective. So I'd be interested in knowing a lot more about what does this paper tell us that will help us move forward and understand the shareholder disclosure proposal better. So is it better to have private ordering, as the US currently has? And if the private ordering has to work, what are the ways in which private ordering will work better? Is stewardship one way to think about? Should there be corporate governance best practices? And should there be a better role for proxy advisors like ISS in order to motivate investors and companies to deal with these issues? But the second question that the paper does not deal with, and maybe doesn't have to deal with, but I think it's an important one, is do the findings of the paper have anything to do with the move towards mandatory disclosure of political spending, which, as I understand, is currently on the regulatory back burner for controversial reasons that have been going on in the US since Citizens United. But I think there's a lot of debate and discussion at a theoretical level, but does the paper add to that in this context? And the third question is, what does this tell us about various choices available? Is it private ordering, public mandatory scope of disclosures? And is it worth thinking about what's happening in other jurisdictions? The paper makes a mention of the US, but I think to the extent, I do admit this is not a comparative paper, but to the extent that some comparative benefits can be taken in order to understand the US system itself, I think it may be better, but I don't want to overdo that aspect of the paper because this is understandably a US-based paper. I would also be interested in knowing more about, I think you've talked about heterogeneity in investor preferences, but it'll be interesting to see what actually drives this phenomenon. And is this something that's desirable, or is that something troublesome? Is it by design or default? I think these issues would be interesting. Maybe the data tells us part of the story, but I think this is worth developing as well. And the last point I'd like to make is I think it would be interesting to see how this paper engages more with the earlier literature. There's a reference in the literature section, but I think it would be useful to come back to it and see how this kind of meshes or does not mesh with those aspects of other papers. So finally, I think it's definitely an important piece of work, not just on the area of political expenditures and disclosures, but I think even in the area of shareholder proposals more generally. And given what I've read in the field in terms of the literature, I think certainly this has the potential to be the paper that defines the field going forward. So thanks again for the opportunity to comment on this paper.
Adriana, do you want to take a couple of minutes?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Those were extremely generous comments. So I have spent, well, Jill and I, but we've spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between sort of electoral political spending and lobbying. So you can think of them as being sort of like substitutes, right? I can either give a lot of money on the front end to get access to this politician down the line, or I can just invest more in trying to persuade them down the line. Right, so you might think that there's sort of a hydraulic effect, like if we tamp down on spending here, we'll just get more of it there. But it's a little bit hard to know. But I will say, apparently, just like the sociology of this space is that there are people that do the political proposals and there are people that do the lobbying proposals, and never the two shall meet. And it's even like one of the New York pension funds brings political proposals, and the other one brings lobbying ones. And I don't really understand why, and maybe we can try to have a few more conversations with the proponents in this space to learn more, but they just don't overlap, which is weird. I also, just a quick point, yeah, the Zicklin Index being created by the CPA is like endlessly fascinating to me, and I don't know what to make of it, other than I don't think their index is cooked. Like I think it is a truthful description of the disclosures that are being made. I think 100%. When you get a CPA proposal, you like go through their index and you're like, what is the easiest thing on this list for me to do that will the least interfere with what I want? I will do that. That will improve me on the index. So you can think of that as like gaming, or you can think of it as complying. I'm not exactly sure how to think about it, but like, yes, you will do the least costly thing first. And like 100% they do that. That even came up in a couple of our conversations that people are like, okay, let me find the easiest thing. Some of the things they're asking for are less intrusive, so I'll do that first. But of course, that's gonna gradually march you up the index if you keep doing that iteratively. The last thing I'll just say is like, I am so uncertain about whether disclosure of political spending is good for shareholders or not. Like, it might be good for shareholders to the extent that we think this is an agency problem and the CEO is just giving money to their preferred candidate, and that's just like bad corporate governance. It could also be that donating money to candidates is good for shareholder value. It might be that they'd all be better off if none of them did it, but they're all worse off if everybody else is doing it. And so I just think it's like really a hard question to even know, like normatively as a person who cares about shareholder value, what I should think of this.
Okay, we'll take 3 questions at a time. Start with Alon.
So I have a couple of questions. If I had to ask Nadia to model sort of what's optimal for companies to do, and then also endogenize disclosure, what would she say, right? What would the model kind of spit out as?
Can we ask her?
Yeah. She gets my questions all the time. But so question number 1 is that, because if we want to see shareholder submissions are pushing companies towards optimality or away from optimality, we need a sense for what's optimal. And so that's question number one. Question number two is, and again, it reflects my ignorance, how does it happen, like within a corporation? Who makes that decision? Is it the board, the legal counsel, the CEO? Do they wake up one day and decide we want to do X? And then kind of how does it actually happen? Just wonder, two questions.
Tom Gosling.
Thanks very much. I'm really delighted that you're studying this. I think it's such a topical issue, and certainly if you look at kind of investor activism on ESG issues, I mean, political lobbying is viewed as kind of the next big frontier, and the great hope for future action. So I think it's great. I mean, you've mentioned already, I mean, there's a lot of evidence in the sort of shareholder engagement literature more broadly that, engagement by even a minority of shareholders can get companies to do non-costly things. It's going to be really interesting to just keep tracking this as to, does this actually change anything that these companies do? And I guess it's probably early days for that. The second comment I had was just about, is there more you could do around the role of kind of initiatives that are in the background here? So, things like the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance has been kind of quite prominent on promoting asset manager engagement around voting on corporate lobbying. So is there a connection between the investors that are doing this and these initiatives? And that might provide some interesting insight. Actually, are these initiatives doing something? Are they changing what asset owners are doing here? And kind of linked to that, I mean, one of the main motivations around political lobbying is not so much a sort of a shareholder value argument at the company level, but this universal owner argument that the world in general is better if we have, aligned lobbying. And in that regard, I think it'd be quite interesting to dig in a little bit to the nature of these asset managers' support votes, and actually whether they, what is it that's going on there in those average support? Is that because there are certain proposals that they are supporting, or actually is it just specific sub-mandates that they have that means that part of the shares that they hold are getting voted because either it's pass-through voting or they've got a particular mandate with an activist asset owner who's wanting them to vote on that?
Ailsa.
Yes, I'd like to really echo some points raised by the two first, by Alon and Tom, which is I see transparency partly as an end in itself, but mostly as a means to an end. So is there any information in your data about what this does, what disclosure does to how much companies spend politically, where they spend it, et cetera, et cetera? So what is the bottom line effect of all this? Thank you.
Go ahead, Adriana.
So I have spent a lot of time bashing my head against the wall trying to figure out whether we want less political. But again, I come at this as like, I care about shareholder value maximization. Society's great and all, but I just care about, is this good for the shareholders? And so I don't even know whether transparency is actually good for the shareholders of the company. Because to the extent that you can like lobby or spend money electorally without having to tell people about it, that might be good for you. And so I truly like, again, you can distinguish between the universal owner view and the individual. So I just think this is an incredibly complicated question to get to the normative answer. Again, if you think it's an agency problem and you think that the CEO is just funneling money to their pet entity, then you would want transparency because that's going to help you reduce the agency problem. And if you think that there's a potential risk, so you think that they're going to give money and then it's going to non-transparently, and then it's going to come out later that you did this, and then it's going to be a big scandal in your face, then that might be a risk management approach. But I just think I don't actually know, and this goes to Alon's initial question, I don't know what the optimal answer is, and I don't really know what we're trying to do here. I know that the CPA thinks that political spending is bad, and they want less of it. But they're not asking for that directly, they're doing it by asking for disclosure, just like typically, people will ask for disclosure about carbon emissions, not because they actually care about the disclosure of carbon emissions, because there's a shaming effect that they're hoping to have. I did try to look to see whether the 527 spending goes down, but then I stopped because I realized that it's all, you can spend money in so many different ways, and it's all just sort of like a shell game. So, unless you have the entire universe of all political spending, knowing whether one category went down or up tells you almost nothing. And that's part of the problem with the other literature. They're actually even worse. They're just looking at PAC spending, which is the most directly tied to that company. And like the first thing you're going to do is stop spending through your PAC and you're going to give it to the Republican Governors Association or like other things like that. So it's just really hard to try to measure. Okay, I'm talking too long. But what is this question that I scribbled down that I now can't really read? We'll talk after because I can't read my handwriting. I'm sorry.
Okay, Bobby Bartlett and then Connor Kehoe.
Super interesting findings and a nice discussion as well. I'm just going to align myself with sort of the I like a model sort of camp that you've been hearing, and I know it's hard, but I think you spent all this time with this data, and I think you can actually probably at least weigh in, or at least I'd invite you to weigh in. Like I'm looking at your figure 2, which suggests that. It is in the paper that's posted, which is that, that you've got these CPA political proposals, and to me it looks like they're just talking their book, right? It's like, if you don't score well on the Zitlan Index, they're going to target you, totally untethered to materiality. It's unrelated to sort of the monotonic relationships you saw with the non-CPA political proposals. And then if you look at sort of the shareholder vote support, even among the pensions, it seems as if they like sort of reflexively support the CPA political proposals, and then they actually like really don't support the non-CPA political proposals, which actually seem to be the material ones that are being posted. So this seems like a very dysfunctional system just from my sort of 20 minutes of exposure to it. You've been exposed to it for much longer. I think it would, because I think I'm struggling to figure out, other than my sort of conjecture, like what to make of this from a sort of policy prescription. It doesn't seem very functional to me. And you're the experts, and so I would just, again, invite you to try to conjecture what the model might spit out.
Thanks, Connor Kehoe.
I wondered if there's a case here for a corporate governance norm where directors might need to evaluate the returns they get on corporate spending. And there was one example like this in the UK a few years ago, required directors to make a viability statement. And the regulator got me to go around and talk to the companies. And net, some very large companies had never really projected their cash flows over 3 to 5 years. And they had to do it as a result of this. And I can remember 2 FTSE 100 companies discovered they had too much capital. They couldn't think of circumstances that were so extreme that they would need all the capital buffers they had. So perhaps, and have you seen any motions along those lines, not requiring disclosure, but requiring disclosure that directors have considered the NPV of this lobbying and concluded that it's a positive outcome?
We'll take one more question.
Yes.
Yeah, Ellen?
Thanks. So I guess this is me begging you to do a third paper, just following on Ailsa and others.
My whole career.
Because it really is the holy grail, right? To figure out if any of this actually leads to company level behavior change. And just to the points about universal ownership, you've got shareholder value really tied to, most of your shareholders are diversified shareholders, right? And so you do end up with this distortion of political behavior as a result of the current activity that we see. I think there is a way to do this in the climate space, if that's useful, because it looks like there is a pretty firm shift towards using trade associations as the mouthpiece on climate specifically. So, and then there are clumps of shareholder resolutions, like for example, the New York City pension fund has been really focused on utilities and banks. So you could actually just look at those and see if there is a shift in the listed names of members of those trade associations and or their income, because they have to pay these membership fees. And I would just, again, beg you to do this, please. It would be so great, so very useful, and it would be very useful for the practitioners in particular. So please, please, please.
Okay, Adri, go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, I deciphered my handwriting on Tom, your question about, so what we are looking at here, and I didn't go into it in detail because I only had 35 seconds, but when I showed you those asset managers, that was the votes specifically on their S&P 500 or closest to their S&P 500 equivalent fund. So this is not all the votes they cast, this is just for that. So to the extent that they are using custom proxy voting, this is the one they're using for their flagship fund. Because otherwise, so it is really that they are voting all one way on any particular resolution, and it's just that across resolutions it averages out the way it averages out. I think DFA had voted yes on exactly one, which I think was a mistake, because it was a weird one that like very few other people voted for, and I don't know what else happened there. And incidentally, when you look, like Vanguard is really, really low, BlackRock is slightly higher, they're both like sub 6%. But what is interesting is it is not the case that all of the ones that Vanguard voted yes on, BlackRock also voted yes on. So it was actually, you know, you split them out, it's quite different. So they do seem to be doing something, which is, again, I don't know, again, to Bobby, to your point about this seems very dysfunctional. Like, it could well be that they're all throwing darts, but at least they're throwing different darts. They're not all just throwing the same dart. This is a bit of a Rorschach test, I think, to your point about the dysfunctionality. I think you can look at this and you can think that the pension funds are doing something that's good, or you can look at this and think that the pension funds are doing something bad. And I think there's maybe a disagreement between the co-authors about how we look at the Rorschach test. And I think that's really good, because I think what it does is it causes us to be as objective as possible and just like state the facts and leave it. So in some ways, I think some of the lack of normativity comes from the fact that there isn't a consensus about whether this is like good for the plan participants or whether it's bad, and whether it's good for the economy or bad for the economy. And so instead, we're just like, here is the stuff, and you can read into it what you will, which I think is actually healthy. So some of the disclosures that are being asked for are about the governance around political spending. I don't think there is a specific one about like do an NPV analysis or anything like that, but it's certainly, and this goes to actually Alon's initial question as well, like who makes these decisions? Part of what the CPA asks for is having board oversight over political activity. And telling us, like having a committee that does this, and that is one of the dimensions of this disclosure that they're asking for. But not all companies do it that way.
Okay, Eric and Marco, you each get one brief question to which Adri does not get to respond.
My favorite kind of question.
Well, I'm going to phrase my question differently then. Super interesting paper. I want to pick up the thread of where Bobby left off on sort of how functional this system. I'm going to get, I don't think you report on the actual win rates of the proposals that go the distance. It's got to be either close to zero or zero. And so that's consistent with the literature, which, you know, begs this question, like what are these proposals trying to do? It could be that the settlements and withdrawals are doing a lot of action. But one way to consider this is that they actually are trying to get at an agency cost question. And I've got a proposal for you to think about how you might be able to do it. So Riley Steele, who you do cite, has a paper coming out in the APSR that has a full crosswalk between board composition and individual spending, as well as corporate PAC spending. And not only would you be able to get a sense of at least of the companies that report on 527 spending, but you also can like size those things together. But I think maybe an interesting thing to do is to say, look, to what extent does political composition of the board members and officers, as reflected by their own political giving, either predict the rate of making these proposals or responds to the making of these proposals after the fact? And I think that might be a really cool way to get at the agency cost problem.
Marco?
Has there been any pushback on either the proposals or CPA since November 2024? For example, has CPA been threatened with having their non-profit status removed?
We can ask them, I don't know.
Okay.
Not that I've seen.
If there's no pushback, why not? Does that mean they're maybe not that effective?
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.